Hi, everybody. This is Mrs. McManus. You're going to find that this screencast is split into two. You'll hear a difference in my voice from the first one versus the second one as I'm recording this while sick on the first one. But I want to give you a little bit of an introduction as to what civil law is all about and what are some of the things that we're going to talk about here in this class. So as we continue these notes, I'd like you to open up the packet and to write these down. You'll see that there are outline notes that I have given you that are partially filled out and that also contain things like charts. And that is because when we take notes in class, it's very rare that I just say, open up your notebooks or grab out a piece of paper and just write stuff down. I almost always have something for you to follow along with. And so as we take notes, I also want to point out that it is okay to abbreviate. You're going to find as you get further on in your academic career that you're going to need to learn how to take notes that best suit your own needs. So you could abbreviate or put things in shorthand. You don't necessarily have to write down word for word what I have on the screen. So in this class, we're going to be discussing the legal profession in civil cases. So, if you know anything about criminal cases, perhaps because you took my criminal justice course, or perhaps because you watch a lot of, crime shows or listen to podcasts or whatever, you've heard the term prosecution and defense. Well, that is different in a civil case. And so we're going to be talking about defense, but we're also going to be talking about the plaintiff in a lot of cases as well. And so the law works different in civil cases than it does in criminal cases. And so we're going to not only be talking about the legal profession, but about trial by jury, and then about tort law. Tort law falls into three different categories, and we'll talk about that a little bit further in a few slides. And then we're going to look at property law. And that has to do with not only, of course, like real estate property, but private property or even intellectual property. We're going to talk about consumer and housing law. So if, a company creates a faulty product, what rights do you as a consumer have in order to find restitution if that product in some way or shape gives you harm in some way? And we'll also be talking about housing law. So in fact, I'm going to have us take a peek at some rental leases because typically everybody in their life at one point or another is going to rent an apartment or rent a house or rent something, even if it's rent a car. And so it's very important to understand what those things have in those contracts because you are signing and agreeing to them. And so we'll be discussing that. And then perhaps one of my favorite units is constitutional rights and liberties. We'll be talking about some of the major rights that we as American citizens have, and that has to do with freedom of speech, freedom of press and religion, and including various other rights that we also have. And so that will usually take us to the end of the year, at least while the seniors are here. And then if time permits, we'll also have a unit on family law. And this has to do with marriage, divorce, child custody, and that type of thing as well. So what I do want to point out, and I always need to start this, particularly if you have not taken the criminal justice class, is that you need to understand that there's a pretty distinct difference between criminal law and civil law. So in criminal law, the purpose is to punish crimes that occur, but also prevent potential crimes from occurring. And the government is always the prosecutor. So when there's someone who is charged for a crime, they are charged for a crime because the government is instituting that charge, usually on behalf of the victim, but it is technically coming from the government. So at the state level, it's the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and at the federal level, it'd be, the federal government. Now, in civil law, it's disputes between private parties. And so what we have to consider is that everybody has a duty in our society to be respected by one another, and the civil cases result when that does not happen. And so that could be that somebody was negligent. It could be that somebody intentionally tried to do harm to somebody else. And what also occurs is that damages are typically awarded and not punishment. And so if you are sued, you do not go to jail for if you are found liable or found responsible for that particular harm. Instead, you might have to pay, or there could be some other court order that is inflicted upon you. Now, there are a few exceptions, and I believe we talk about that in an upcoming slide, so I'm just going to let that be for a second. Now, in civil law, The burden of proof. So what that means is that the party that is leading the lawsuit has to prove by a preponderance of the evidence. And that term means that more than 50% of the evidence has to point towards that person, committing the harm, for example. So let's say that somebody is getting sued for driving under the influence. And so if the person who is suing the person who decided to drive under the influence can prove more than 50% of the evidence shows that that person was indeed intoxicated and it did result in a harm to that person, then that would be meeting this burden of proof called preponderance of evidence. Now, clear and convincing evidence is a more rigorous level of proof. Honestly, we will not talk about it past this particular slide, or no longer in any other part of the course. Clear and convincing evidence you see more in like property lawsuits and having to do with that. So like real estate and that type of thing. Now, for clear and convincing evidence, the party has to prove that it is substantially more likely than not that, this person committed that harm or whatever. Now, in a civil trial, you have different rights. So one important thing is people always get really surprised when they hear that, oh, well, that civil trial took like 5 years for it to actually occur. And people are like, what are you talking about 5 years? Because in a criminal trial, we're usually used to it happening within a few months or up to a year at most. And that is because there is a constitutional right that says that you are entitled to a speedy and public trial, and that is for criminal cases. But there's no constitutional right that says that you need to have a speedy trial for a civil case. So what you find is that they tend to last a lot longer. Now, there is no exclusionary rule that has to do with the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution and unreasonable searches and seizures. There's no right to remain silent. So we're going to be talking about one of my favorite criminal cases is the O.J. Simpson case. Now, O.J. Simpson was found not guilty in a criminal case, but he was found responsible or liable in the civil case. And one of the things that came into the civil case was that O.J. actually had to testify in the civil case. Now, and that's because there is no constitutional law that says that you cannot testify against yourself in civil case. There is that right in a criminal case. It's called self-incrimination, but not civil. So that's something to think about too. And there's also a diminished right to cross-examine hostile witnesses. And then also there is no legal obligation for the state to provide a lawyer for indigent defendants. When we say indigent, that means that people who cannot afford one. So if you've heard the Miranda warning in the criminal cases, it says you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can or will be used against you. You have the right to an attorney, and if you cannot afford one will be provided to you. Well, that's all well and good, but that's in a criminal case. That right does not exist in a civil case. Sometimes you will find that there are state agencies that will help you find a cheap or free attorney who might take your civil case, but they are not legally obligated to do that. And I'm going to start off with this chart, and you'll see that part 2 is going to come with the second chart. So the legal victim in a criminal case is the state, whereas in a civil case, it's the individual. And then when you initiate an action, it's in a criminal case, it's the prosecutor. Now there's a state prosecutor, or there's federal prosecutors. At the state level, you've heard them referred to as district attorneys and assistant district attorneys, but at the federal level, they're called U.S. attorneys. But in a civil case, it's private party or parties, and these people are known as plaintiffs. Now, I say parties because you can actually have more than one person sue you. So you may have heard, for example, of class action lawsuits. And this could be where a large group of people were potentially harmed by the actions of an individual or perhaps a corporation. And so that group of people might get together and file a class action lawsuit, meaning they pool their resources and they get attorney to represent all of them. And they all potentially receive some kind of damages at the end of the civil case. Excuse me, going back to the chart here, though, the issue before the court in a criminal case is, did the defendant, the person who is accused of committing the crime, violate a criminal law, right? That is what they're there to prove in a criminal case. But in a civil case, it's different. Did the defendant, the person who was accused of causing harm, did that person cause harm to the plaintiffs? So in the example I gave you on the last slide of the person who committed a driving under the influence case, they could be tried in criminal case and they could be found guilty, but the person can also sue them in civil law, in a civil trial. Not many people actually understand that can happen to both. And that would be, for example, what happened in the O.J. Simpson trial, right? Is that in the criminal case, it was filed and he was found not guilty, but then the families of the two victims decided to bring him to civil court as well. So in that case, did O.J. Simpson cause harm to the plaintiffs? And that's the question that was at the crux of that particular trial. Now, lastly, in a criminal court, the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. That means that if there is an inkling of doubt, and it's a reasonable doubt, then you cannot in good conscience find that person guilty of that crime. Now, that's different. Remember, as I said in the civil case, it's preponderance of the evidence, meaning that more than 50% of the evidence proves that this person committed harm towards the plaintiff. And again, sometimes it could be clear and convincing evidence as well. So, in talking a little bit more about the differences between criminal and civil law, in criminal law, the prosecution is the one that has the burden of proof. They're the ones that have to prove their case. Technically, in criminal law, the defense doesn't have to do anything. They could sit there, and if the prosecution has not proven their case, they could still have their defendant be found not guilty. However, in civil law, it's different. Initially, the plaintiff has to start off by trying to prove how the other party has harmed them. However, in the end, both parties, have to prove their cases. Now, in criminal law, we have that there's a remedy, which is usually punishment of some sort. It could be probation, community service, jail, prison, or even death. Like we're talking the death penalty. But in civil law, usually it's compensation of some sort or some type of monetary damage. Sometimes it can also be called what we say is punitive damages, and I'll explain that more in a moment. But sometimes it's the resolution of conflict. So as I talked about before, let's say you are arguing with your neighbor over where your property lines are. You might not want or need money from that particular conflict, but you might in fact just want it resolved, and so that the judge will step in and say where the property lines are. Now, in a criminal case, you are entitled to rights such as the 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th, and 14th Amendments. So remember, these are rights like protection from unreasonable searches and seizure, or that you are protected from self-incrimination and double jeopardy, that you have the right to an attorney, and so on and so forth. But remember, the Bill of Rights was created and those rights were enumerated in order to protect the average citizen from the tremendous power of the government. So in a civil case, the government isn't necessarily involved. And because it's a private matter, the amendments do not apply. Because again, those are rights that are owed by the state to the individuals, not by other private individuals. Now, in a criminal case, if it does not go as they want, the defendant is allowed to appeal the decision. However, in a civil case, if it doesn't go how they want, either the plaintiff or the defendant can, of course, appeal this decision. So we're going to talk a little bit about torts, and this is the body of law, as I told you before, that has to do with harm caused by the plaintiff, perhaps because of something that the defendant did, or perhaps because of something that the defendant did not do. And again, this establishes the expectation that all human beings should act with reasonable care towards other people and towards their property. And so tort law really exists to determine what harm has been done and how we should best remedy that harm, so that therefore the plaintiff can return to a position similar to the one that they had prior to the harm occurring. And so typically when it comes to tort law, we have damages that are awarded. Usually they are monetary. And this is meant to compensate the plaintiff for perhaps any injuries that they sustained, whether it's physical injury, perhaps maybe there's financial costs or emotional costs as well. And there are 3 different types of damages. The first is compensatory, and that is to compensate, to pay an injured person for being harmed. And so that could be, for example, let's say I'm going to use that same example that you're at the mall and you slip and fall on a banana peel, right? And you're suing the mall for not keeping a clean and healthy atmosphere, right? And let's say you have sustained injuries and therefore you have hospital bills, that you have missed work and therefore missed getting paid, and that you perhaps have missed school and have to try to catch up, and that there's emotional damage and so on and so forth. And so the compensatory damages are to compensate you for that. So they might calculate how many days of missed work you had and pay you compensation for that. Or they might say, okay, you had $3,000 of medical bills. We're going to give you $3,000 to pay back those medical bills, right? So that's what compensation, what they mean there. Nominal is just sort of a nominal damage can oftentimes be like $1 or $5 or $100. And it's really just a small amount of money that the defendant has to pay in order to show that they were wrong in some way. Now, punitive damages are to punish the defendant, and that's what punitive means. And that's because the actions were either malicious, willful, or outrageous. And juries typically decide how much money is appropriate. And you're going to see in some of the cases that you're going to be working on, with the Kmart case and the barbecue gasoline case and the McDonald's case, that punitive damages were given to the plaintiff in this case. And sometimes it's both punitive and compensatory damages. So you can actually have both types of damages be awarded to somebody in a case. Now, when we're talking about the categories of torts, first we have intentional acts. And this is where the defendant deliberately caused harm to another person or their property. And this could be, for example, that you deliberately pulled out a chair from someone as they were going to sit down, and therefore that person fell and, I don't know, they broke their back, right? And so that could be an intentional act, or what they call an intentional tort. And then we have negligent acts. And this could be that you were negligent, that you had a duty to act in a certain way, and that duty was breached. And so, for example, let's say you work at an office building and you are in charge of keeping the outside walkways clean and clear during winter storms. And you're just like, I don't feel like doing it today. It's really cold out. And so you don't do it. You don't salt the walkway, but somebody slips and falls and hurts themselves. Well, you could be sued, or the business owner could be sued, because you were negligent. Even though you didn't intentionally want somebody to get hurt, because you did not act in a certain way, you breached that duty to act reasonably, and therefore harm resulted. And then there is one called strict liability. And that you typically see with big businesses and corporations. And this particularly has to do with those that are engaged with dangerous activities. So let's say you own a company that blows up buildings and demolishes them when they need to be taken down. So that is inherently dangerous, right? There are people who could get hurt. And so if somebody is harmed in that, then that is considered to be a strict liability case, that you, as a business or corporation engaging in that dangerous activity, have extra responsibility for the consequences of those actions. Now, torts are really sort of in the last, I'd say probably since the mid 1990s or late 80s, having to do particularly with the McDonald's case. But there's some people that say that there are frivolous lawsuits. And for example, some people say that the McDonald's case was a frivolous lawsuit. I'm going to show you a documentary that actually points that perhaps it wasn't so frivolous, and you'll see why. But that there are so many frivolous lawsuits out there, like a person, a teacher who got sued because she gave her student too much homework, right? Or a person who got sued because they didn't put the cap right on their lotion and it squirted all over them and it ruined their clothes, right? Those are frivolous lawsuits. But they have become very politicized, and it's become political fodder for many politicians. And the point is to try to reduce this, like, we're going to sue the bastards, right? If something went wrong in your life. But tort reform is actually still kind of very controversial. And so we'll touch a little bit upon that in this class. And then we're going to talk about property law. And this has to do with lots of different kinds of property. We have property that could be personal property, and that could be, of course, like your phone, your computer, things that otherwise you keep on your person. Then we have things that are considered to be real property, and that means like real estate or land or your house and that type of thing. And then there's intellectual property, and that could be things that you've created with your mind that you consider your property. So it could be art, music, writing, even visuals at this point, like videos and other types of things. We're going to skip watching the Google and the World Brain video for this one. But this case, which hopefully we'll get to in this course if we have time, talks about how Google has actually been sued many times, but sued in this particular one case because they were taking books that were copywritten and they were publishing them online for everybody to read for free. And that, of course, violates copyright law. And it became a very, very big case in the news when it was litigated. Then we're going to talk about contract laws. Now, a contract is an agreement between two or more people in exchange of something's value. And so it legally binds the parties to uphold their end of the bargain. And so with a valid contract, you have at least two parties that have legal capacity in signing the contract. When they mean legal capacity, it means that they have to usually be over the age of 18 in the United States, as well as they have the legal capacity in that they are mentally fit and stable. For example, it is unconscionable to sign a contract when someone is so under the influence that they can't really probably make decisions for themselves, right? Or it might be unconscionable to have a contract signed by someone who might not be mentally with it. Perhaps they are having a mental illness episode, or perhaps they are intellectually disabled. And then, of course, the third part is that both parties have to agree to the terms of the contract in good faith, and it must have both a promise and a consideration, meaning that something has been promised and something, will happen in return. And it can be written or verbal. Each state definitely has different rules about verbal contracts. I would say it's always best to have a written contract because then you have proof if you need it, of course, when the time comes. Now, what can happen is that people can be sued for breach of contract. And so this is where somebody breaks the contract because they don't live up to the agreement. And then that person who has been harmed by that breach of contract can actually sue for damages, or they could cancel it, or they could ask the court to order the other party to perform. When I say perform, sometimes people get confused about that. Let's say you have a contractor who is a carpenter and he is supposed to do work on your house. And you sign a contract with the person. You order the lumber so that it's there and it's ready for them. And then they decide to break your contract. Well, you could, of course, sue them, or you could bring them to court and just say, no, I just want this work to be done on my house. Therefore, I'd like them to perform the service that they were contracted to do. And so that's what we mean by, asking the party to perform. Now, we will also in this course discuss consumer law, like consumer protection, and what happens when we are deceived with sales practices, and just generally like how to be a smart consumer. I'd say that actually, like, when we start to talk about this, most of my students are typically pretty smart consumers, although not everybody. And so it's always good to have a conversation about it. And then when we talk about housing law, we'll also be talking about leases, which are a form of contract, in particular with landlord and tenant relationships and issues. And so if, for example, you are to rent an apartment when you go to college, you have particular responsibilities as a tenant, but your landlord also has particular responsibilities. And if you do not keep up your end of the bargain, or they do not keep up theirs, then you could potentially have a lawsuit, or something happen where they might need you to do something specific to perform. And then this will probably be our last unit, but I'm not entirely sure. But of course, we know that the U.S. Constitution affords American citizens many rights. And states have their own constitutions and their own laws that also protect individual rights. And these rights are meant to try to protect the immense power of the government. It's meant to protect the citizens, I should say. And so the government has a lot of power. They have the power to potentially put you in jail. They have the power to take away your property, right, in certain circumstances. And so these amendments to the Constitution and these other codes and regulations are meant to try to protect the average citizen from them. But there are, of course, limits to some of these as well. So we're going to be talking about them when it comes to the First Amendment, like freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, petition. We'll also be talking about it in terms of the right to privacy. Some things that fall under this could be, for example, abortion, or it could be, in history, if we're looking at some historical cases, same-sex relationships were actually sort of lumped under the right to privacy as well. And then we have discrimination cases. And this, of course, could be discrimination based on race, but also could be discrimination based on gender, based on sexual orientation, based on socioeconomic status, based on age. There's all kinds of different discrimination that we'll talk about. And if we have time, we will talk about family law. So in Massachusetts, when we say family law, we mean divorce, we mean paternity, we mean child support, custody, visitation, adoption, and the termination of parental rights, as well as preventing abuse. And so this revolves around mostly, as you can see, children and the parents and or foster parents and or adoptive parents that are involved. And so that is it for our notes today. If you have any questions when it comes to this stuff, please don't hesitate to let me know.